Oregon Hidden Legacy explores the life of Vicki Nakashima, whose multiracial background and dedication to civil rights have profoundly impacted Portland's social fabric. From early family tensions surrounding activism to influential roles in educational and community programs, Vicki shares a journey marked by a deep commitment to justice. Her work spans several decades and includes significant contributions to improving access to education and legal rights for marginalized communities.
Well, Vicki Nakashima is a third-generation Japanese American born in Spokane, Washington, many, many years ago. Grew up in Kirkland, Washington, east of Seattle, and moved to Portland in 1967. And I moved here to help take care of my grandparents, who lived in Portland, in southeast Portland, from well before the war. My grandfather immigrated here in 1901. My father and mother were born U.S. citizens. They were born in Seattle, Washington, and grew up there and went to school. My father was studying to be an architect when World War II broke out, and the decision was made to incarcerate the Japanese Americans and people of Japanese ancestry who lived on the West Coast. There were 120,000 Japanese who were relocated to concentration camps, in effect. One of the things that stands out in my mind about that whole experience is that Japanese people tend to want to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and they don't like to complain. As a result, my entire generation and those who follow us often know very little about their experience of being incarcerated. They didn't talk about the hardships or the conditions. What we heard about was kids being born, people learning to dance, getting dressed up, playing sports, but they didn't talk about the dust that permeated the horse stall or cow stall that they had to live in, or the cold that during the winter they experienced because there was no insulation, and living with thousands of other people. In Portland, Oregon, the temporary relocation center was the Portland Expo Center, which we all know at one time was a stockyard and a fairgrounds, and they converted the stalls that the animals lived in into temporary quarters that many Japanese Americans had to stay in from the time they were removed from their homes and swept away until the more permanent camps were completed and constructed. In fact, every year the Expo Center has a commemoration of not only the incarceration of Japanese Americans, but also the Vanport flood and the impact the government and the racist policies had on Native Americans and the Latino community. It's held in June, late May, June of every year, to bring back those memories so that we don't forget, so that we hope that doesn't happen again. And the unfortunate part is that the Expo Center is the center of where the Vanport flood took place. It's where thousands of people were flooded out of their homes and lost their homes and had to move during the 1940s, where the Japanese Americans were incarcerated until they moved to other camps. But that was a difficult life, and it was a memory that often even all of the communities who were involved didn't want to necessarily remember. but it's so important that that's shared, that the children and grandchildren and the community understand what happened. Well, I was fairly young and I loved to ice skate. So my father took me to Rockefeller Center to ice skate, which was a thrill because I had seen it on television and I got to take my picture there. We had relatives who lived in Pennsylvania that we went to visit. So that was a wonderful opportunity to experience the big city. My parents were very proud people and studied hard and worked hard. So going on a trip like that was very special. And being an only child, I didn't have lots of siblings to have to share experiences with. I was the only one, and probably pretty much a tomboy. My father loved to fish and hunt and play golf and do all the outdoor things, and he was really good at it, any one of them, whether it was fishing for whatever kind of thing you could eat that swam in the water. We would do that, or hunting, or just being outdoors. So I think I was meant to be a boy instead of a girl, because I had a hard time with dressing up, and I had a hard time with being very ladylike. I arrived in Portland and I was 20. I had been attending a community college in Seattle. I moved to Portland because my grandparents were very elderly and needed help, and they wouldn't move anywhere. They lived just off of Hawthorne and 41st Street in Portland, and had a lovely little house, tiny house in Portland. And they had lived there, I believe, I haven't been able to date it, but I'm guessing somewhere in maybe the 30s they moved to Portland from other places. And then when the evacuation of Japanese happened, they left and later came back to Portland and then lived there when I moved here. I arrived and I needed to have a job in addition to helping them. So I was attending Portland Community College, but I was also went to work for the Head Start program. And being 1967 was almost the height of the civil rights movement. It was a very raucous time in terms of civil rights and community activism. So I managed to arrive. I have memories of the hardships in the community and working in education. I worked first at Head Start, the follow-through program with Portland Public Schools, and then I went to work at the Model Cities program as a community analyst, community education analyst, and then I went to work at John Adams High School, which was a new high school in Northeast Portland, and it was, I went to work there as a community agent. So I experienced a lot. It was, I think many people who are as old or older than I am will remember the War on Poverty. It was an infusion of maybe reaction to the civil discourse that was going on in our world, but there was a real need for, in all areas, that there was community involvement and planning, that it was the height of how do we desegregate the schools, or how do we provide magnet programs so that there were offerings for all children and not eliminating the inclusion that was so important. There were so many needs in terms of home ownership or building a new freeway. I-5 took out a good part. All of the construction and development, including the not convention center, but the development of around the Broadway corridor and the convention facilities, event facilities, took out disproportionately communities of color. And this was on the heels of not 20 years earlier or more, Vanport. Vanport was predominantly people of color. They think of it as perhaps being African American, but there were many Japanese Americans. So any community, even Northeast, when we talk about what happened in terms of the community and the hardships that people who lived in those communities experienced, there were other communities of color that were represented there and their businesses. Working in the Model Cities program in education, that program was designed to find ways to counter the discrimination that was happening on all fronts around education. Jefferson High School was predominantly black. John Adams came in and drew away a large part of the African American student body to the new John Adams Experimental High School that they brought in. The teachers, there were very few teachers of color. Many of the teachers who are now retired, who've been part of your series, whether it's Michael Chappie Grice or Ken Berry or Ron Herndon, they would not have gotten into education at the time they did if it hadn't been programs like to educate more teachers of color. Almost every university in Oregon had a program to train teachers of color. U of O had a correctional teacher corps program that was run by Art Pearl, a dynamic educator who created opportunities for hundreds of teachers to get into education. There's a program, the B2 program at Oregon State University. The Portland State program had trained teachers, Portland Community College. And if it hadn't been for them, if you look at the retirees that have retired from education, not only in Portland, but also Salem and other communities around the state, many of the teachers of color came through those programs that provided not only educational assistance for the payment of tuition or opportunities to engage in on-the-job training or working with families and parents to look at education differently. So that's one example. I mean, overnight you could go from a teacher of color being rare to an infusion of people that were going into teaching as an occupation. The conflicts with the police at the time, Portland Police Bureau had a terrible reputation in the community. And I'm sure many stories have been shared about incidents that happened that are memorable. I remember a young man who was shot in a vacant house, and he was, the community was enraged and went to the U.S. Department of Justice in Seattle, and they held a community meeting in Portland. And I don't know whether there were several community meetings or just a couple of them, but they asked me, the people who were attending this meeting and who knew me, asked if I would ask the questions because they felt like the Department of Justice would not let one of them speak, but they might let me speak. And that did indeed happen. And the questions were to prove and to bring out the difficulties. For example, the young man was shot in the back of the head. So it was not as though he pulled a gun if they thought he had a gun. They shot him, and the forensics showed that he was shot in the back of the head. So much of it was to the level that people in the community started long before that not to feel safe, and in particular not to feel safe with the police. It was a career that wasn't open to them, and I think a lot of people had a greater fear of the police than they did of the issues the police were there to address. I mean, to this day, we still have incidents like driving while being a person of color and not just black. You know, I lived in Lake Oswego, and I got stopped at 1 o'clock in the morning for not having a light above my license plate, and I got escorted home. And I don't think I look like a threat, but who knows? And so many people have had those experiences. It's very common. So when you're in a community that you can sit at dinner and say, have you ever had an experience where you felt you were treated differently because of your race? And many people will say, well, yeah, that has happened to me. And I thought it was just a coincidence, but maybe it wasn't. Well, working at John Adams High School, it was an innovative school without walls. One of the programs they started was a program to bring African Americans and lifers from the Oregon State Penitentiary to come and speak to the students at John Adams High School. And they had to clear somebody to pick up the inmates at the penitentiary in Salem and bring them to Portland. And I was the one who was able to do that. They cleared me to do it. They would not allow anyone who had ties. I mean, you couldn't have a relative who was an inmate, or you couldn't have a record that would make you suspect. So I did that, and it kind of opened my eyes to how little things we do create opportunities for somebody who has no chance to come and share their life experience with others. So I got very interested in that. As a result, when my son was very small, he wouldn't want me to say this, but he had some health issues. He was a little on the hyperactive side, and the Free People's Clinic that the Panthers operated, it was on Russell and between Williams and Vancouver, in that building that had the dome on it that's been torn down now. But the Free People's Clinic treated for free anybody who wanted to go get health care. And they had one of the best and most famous doctors, Dr. Lyndon Smith from Portland, who volunteered there on a regular basis. So I started volunteering with the Free People's Clinic, and then I was asked by the Panther Party in Portland if I would serve on the Sickle Cell Anemia Foundation board in Portland. And at that time, there was awareness rolling out about you could test for sickle cell, and then educate people about the impact of sickle cell on them or their family members who may have been carriers. So I agreed to serve on the Sickle Cell Anemia Foundation, and I volunteered with the clinic. which gave me an opportunity to get involved in another activity that really had a lot of meaning to me. To this day, I have great admiration for people who have been involved with the Panthers. And from the very beginning, I felt very comfortable and safe around people who were involved. I didn't feel frightened because they're Black Panthers or because they were activists. Today, I believe to my heart that the Panthers, and it's been written about and documented, that the Panthers were founded based on cross-racial solidarity. One of the Panthers who was a founder was Japanese American, or Japanese, a person of Japanese ancestry. There were Latinos. I have a friend here in Portland who's my age, who said he was very active at the U of O with the breakfast program, that he was a regular volunteer and very welcomed, and he participated with the Panther group that was feeding children, hundreds and hundreds of children in Eugene. And they believed in that, and that cross-racial solidarity carried through to like Cesar Chavez and the farm worker movement. Cesar Chavez, if you went to a farm worker event in Portland or in California, there were people who were Black, who were Latino, who were Native American, Asian, white. They were all there to support this good work if they believed in it. Min Yasui, who was famous from Hood River, he was an attorney that during the incarceration of Japanese Americans, he would not turn himself in. He walked the streets of downtown Portland and went into the police department and asked to be arrested for not meeting the curfew requirement of being off the street. Even though he was a U.S. citizen, he was an attorney, he begged to be arrested to try to prove that it was unconstitutional. It took till the 80s to get that overturned. I don't know the exact date, but it wasn't until many, many decades, and he was a very old man at that time, that it was overturned. And an attorney here in Portland, Peggy Nagai, is one of the people who fought that case to the Supreme Court in order to get that reversed. And it took so many years, from 80 years probably, not quite 80, but the incarceration happened over 80 years ago now, as of today. And there were many others that believed in cross-racial solidarity. Recently, there was an article about the Japanese American, the Japanese person of Japanese ancestry or Japanese American. I'm not exactly sure which one. His name was Richard Aoki, who had been one of the founders of the Panthers, that he was accused of being a snitch, that he was an FBI snitch. And my heart just broke. I mean, I was devastated to think that he might have been a snitch. But I kept reading about it and kept trying to learn more. And I found the Black Studies Department at Ohio State University is quite well known. One of the professors there wrote a book about the Portland Black Panthers. And Kent Ford, who was the founder, was the source of a lot of the information and people to contact. He asked the author to contact me and interview me because I had worked with people who were part of the Panther movement. And so I found this TED Talk in the last 4 or 5 months. And the TED Talk is a fellow professor from Ohio State University in the Black Studies Department. And he spoke about his research and investigation, where he found out what you read about the Black Panthers, 70% of it was written by the FBI. 70% of it was written by the FBI. So that all of a sudden, made me understand Richard Aoki. If what was written or leaked or talked about the Panthers came from the FBI, we don't stand a chance. Being that person on the street who believed that they were doing good work and that the free breakfast program wasn't some plan to overturn the government or to convince children to be on the wrong side of the law. It was a plot. I became interested in incarcerated populations. I was a community agent at John Adams High School. I went on to run the after-school program at Woodlawn Elementary. I was pretty involved in community activities and active in the African American and communities of color that were doing good work, including the Japanese American Citizens League. Those were things that I cared a lot about. So I did quite a bit of volunteer work, and for about 5 years, maybe not quite that long, I was the advisor to the Uhuru Club, which was the Black inmates organization at Oregon State Penitentiary. And they had activities and a club that they could have, but they had to have an advisor who was not connected with either an inmate as a relative or family member or friend. And so I had no connection other than having driven some of the inmates back and forth to Portland to speak at John Adams. So I helped them for 5 years. I also, in my role as a board member of the Sickle Cell Anemia Foundation, I did some speaking around the state to groups about sickle cell anemia. And one of the places I spoke was Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, which at the time, and I'm not sure of the year, early 70s, they had gone through the riots. Most of us remember that they had overtaken the prison, and in the negotiation to end the riot, there was a building that was off limits to anyone from the correctional system as long as they maintained a decorum in that building. And so that's where the Sickle Cell Anemia Foundation program took place with the Black inmates at Walla Walla. So it gave me a chance to be in different communities around some of these issues. But I was also, involved in, I took a job with the state where at the time there were a number of things that our office that worked with community services around the state became engaged in, like the Colegio Cesar Chavez, which just had their 50th anniversary. And it was the only Latino, Hispanic university in Oregon and beyond. And it was in Mount Angel. And I was involved in some of those programs with different communities. Let me give you one example that is just sort of a aha. For many years, I was on the board of the Portland House of Emoja, which I think Nike and a number of other organizations invested in a a lot of resources into. It was on 18th and Northeast Alberta Street, and it served gang-involved youth, and it was a residential program and an educational service program, but it was based on a Philadelphia model where Sister Fatah in Philadelphia created a neutral zone amongst the many gangs in Philadelphia, and that was a safe place that gang members could go, and they had agreed not to incite violence and so it was a safe place for youth that wanted to get out of it. Eventually, the funders, which would be the county and state to a large extent, felt like the gang issue had kind of minimized, that it was not the issue it was, and gentrification and all the changes that were starting to take place in Portland made it less attractive to have a residential facility. And I often wondered, today there are more gangs and youth involved in programs that program would have helped. And the program, the board turned it over, and I was on the board, turned it over to LifeWorks Northwest, and it's still identified as the Umoja House. It was recently given to Head Start, and Ron Herndon, will be able to use that building for Head Start, which is a wonderful thing for the community to have and to be able to preserve. But when you look around and see that some years ago, when they decided to not fund gang programs and services to the extent, Alberta was not a place where most people would go. You didn't have First Friday or Thursday on Alberta Street like you do now. And now people who lived on Alberta Street can't afford to live there. Now there's something wrong with that. There's something terribly wrong with that. And it's an example of how gentrification can take away homes, businesses, and that has happened in many, many locations around the city and the state, but particularly the city. And so programs like that, not just in the African American community, but also other communities, have not had the resources that are needed. And I think, there's been a real transition from trying to find culturally specific approaches to how do we deal with community issues and to empower communities. But what we don't do, or what somebody doesn't do, is put enough money to make that happen. And so a lot of these really great programs that are out there, there's one that I like a lot, is Word is Bond. Is that, I think that's a fabulous program, but I think, they don't probably get the resources that they deserve. And it's only because of foundations, Meyer Memorial and Oregon Community Foundations and others that have really picked up on how do we make sure that our programs are inclusive, and that if they should be culturally specific, that we're able to fund them in that way. I think that's critically important, but we've not reached the point where we have enough resources to adequately fund some of those great programs. I spent so many years working with individuals or with big programs. There have been programs that worked really well that I helped start, and there are programs that I've helped get money for. But the things that make me the proudest, maybe that woman I met in the laundromat in Mount Angel, drying her clothes, that I referred to, connected with state police and she got a job as a dispatcher, or there are hundreds of them. I just ran across, there was someone who applied to be an intern in my office at the Office of Multicultural Health when I was the director. And he had like a year of no work history. And he's sitting in front of me in this interview and he's like gray-haired, right? I mean, he's not young. And I said, okay, you need to explain, why do you have this gap in your history, in your work history? And I won't pass judgment, I just want to know. And he said, I was in prison. And, the state, that's their job, is to help people in the Department of Human Services that don't get served through other resources. So why would that be a barrier? And so I hired him, and he had studied while he was in prison and was very close to a degree. And just a couple days ago, I found his name. I found a card he sent me thanking me for hiring him. And I thought, I need to find him and find out what happened to him and if he's still around. But those are the things that it may have taken me 10 minutes, or it may have taken a phone call to say, well, no, he should be hired. This is the kind of person that our department helps. Or it could be, this young woman, you're looking for people who can be dispatchers who speak Spanish. Her English is excellent, her Spanish is great, and they hired her. But if maybe I hadn't stepped in and made that correct connection, she wouldn't have gotten a job. And I have many of them. I can't even remember most of them, but those are the things that are most rewarding to me. The movement of Japanese members of the Japanese community, the reasons that my grandparents immigrated here was because of the conditions in Japan. The economy was bad. They felt there were opportunities here. My grandpa came here. He had a college education, but most didn't. They worked on the railroad or other menial jobs. My grandma came as a picture bride, and so the experience was very different. And in Japan, for a long time, and even to this day, many Japanese in Japan don't understand why someone like me visits Japan. I look Japanese, but I don't speak a word of Japanese. And that by itself is an issue. I mean, I agree I should have learned Japanese somehow. But my family and the families of all of my generation in the US, they experience the incarceration of Japanese American in basically concentration camps, thinking that they weren't American. And they were. They were born here, they owned homes here, they had businesses. And so after camp, they had to prove that they would not be disloyal to the US. And so they disavowed any connection with Japan. And so my entire generation, for the most part, unless we took it up after college or during college, we didn't learn Japanese because part of that we're American. And we lost that. And for the most part, even to the point of my father and my uncles didn't want my grandma to make Japanese food. They wanted American food, to assimilate, and they didn't have to assimilate. They were US citizens, they were born here, they were educated here, they didn't speak Japanese. I would imagine the biggest fear would be they'll send me to Japan, deport me to Japan. I won't even speak the language. I don't know anybody there. So the bias in Japan is that a lot of people don't understand how Japanese people ended up here in the first place. And then maybe they are not Japanese enough. So when I went to Japan representing the state of Oregon to our sister state in Japan, they had to provide an interpreter everywhere I went. Because Japanese people would look at me and say, well, she looks Japanese. And if I even uttered a hello in Japanese, they assumed I spoke Japanese. And they'd never seen anyone quite like me in certain settings. And so that was an experience for me. And in some cases, people who are Japanese who go back maybe are not treated as, because they're misunderstood. There's a sister, a Catholic sister, who's wonderful, Sister Cecilia, and she lives at Mary's Woods, where I'm on the board in Lake Oswego. And I can't quote it exactly as she gave it to me, but the gist of it is that, plant trees where you won't be able to sit and enjoy the shade, which is a good reminder to me, I won't be around for that tree to grow up to be a beautiful shade tree, but I should still plant that tree.
Thanks for tuning in to Oregon Hidden Legacy. For more information about this podcast, go to OregonHiddenLegacy.org.